Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video. This is the first one of Season 3. We're going to be going over everything Shadow Priest as it pertains to the new patch. A lot to cover today, but I do want to be clear, this is a very much like a pre-season guide. So hopefully I get this edited in time. It'll be up before or just as the patch is actually launching. And with that, you know, we are not getting the full Season 3 experience until the week after. So we're just getting like Mythic Zero dungeons and that kind of thing. But I wanted to at least give you kind of that pre-season update of what talents to pick, what are the changes coming into Shadow Priest itself, and give you a little bit of intro as to what's actually going to come when the full season launches. The reason why I'm staggering this out a little bit is because we did get quite a lot of changes coming into this patch than we do with the typical one, especially compared to all other specs in the game. So with that, I am kind of expecting some of the tuning might not be final, right? So I'm recording this a couple days before the patch comes out. It's very possible that some of the bugs that we still have out there get fixed, or just more tuning comes in general that does change up what we actually want to do. So hopefully once things solidify a little bit more, I'll be able to put out more content to actually give a bit more solid things to try out. I will say, if you're watching this in the future, be sure to check out the written guide on Icy Veins. That'll have the most up-to-date information, and I'll keep that as updated as I can. So without further ado, let's dive into what has changed. All right, so a lot to cover as far as what has actually changed. I'm going to do my best to kind of skim this where it makes sense and give you kind of the Cliff Note version. If you want the full stuff, patch notes will be linked in the description below. So let's kind of cover it. I will say they kind of initially said this was going to be more of a rework. Aside from the initial round of changes that we got, there was no iteration based on feedback or anything, which is overall pretty disappointing. But I will say that it's not a full rework. They added some new things, they adjusted some things, but the core playstyle of what Shadow is pretty much still intact. So let's kind of cover what has been removed. So big ones that are gone. Mind Spike is no longer in the game, so it's kind of weird that they removed Mind Spike, but Dark Ascension is still here, so that kind of weird interaction is still there, I guess. But yeah, Mind Spike is now gone, so now we always have Mind Flay as our filler. Malediction, which just reduced the cooldown of Void Torrent. This is just now made baseline into Void Torrent, so you just get that for free. And then Unfurling Darkness was also removed. This is kind of a... I'm not super surprised they cut this. This was something we added into the Void Reaver builds kind of recently, and I don't know, I'm guessing they didn't like that too much. It was probably not intended for the way that we were using it. So that got removed as well. And then Whispering Shadows also got removed. This just became baseline into Shadow Crash itself. So now, starting this patch, Shadow Crash just has that dot capability baked in. However, it is only 6 targets instead of Whispering Shadows was 8. So that's been changed below, but we have a couple other changes to talk about. So that is what has been removed. Let's cover all the new stuff. So lots of new talents to cover. A lot of these, for the most part, aren't really changing our gameplay very much. So there's a lot of like text here, but honestly, there's not super crazy stuff. I think the two that I'll call out, the first one is Subservient Shadows, which just says your summoned minions, you know, last longer and deal more damage. This thing is a monster node. It works with all of our pets, you know, including shadowy apparitions, which is interesting, but you know, Idol of Cthulhu, Mindbend, all of that kind of stuff it works with, which is cool. A couple other things as well. There's a new node that just gives Shadow Crash some damage, which is kind of problematic in some views, but it does make it kind of a talent that we're going to pick all the time, slightly because of this, so there's that as well. And we also have a new ability called Void Volley, so I'll actually show this to you in-game real quick. So in the talent tree where Malediction was, we now have Void Volley. So the way that this works is after you press Void Torrent, you now your action bar gets replaced with Void Volley for the next 20 seconds. And this is just a movement global that you get to use effectively whenever. You don't have to like rush to press it immediately or anything else like that. Void Torrent does cool down. And it's an instant cast, has that kind of Void Eruption like animation, gives us some insanity, and then also spawns a Void Tendril or Void Lasher depending on the target count. So really nice little mobility spell that kind of got baked into Void Torrent, which is really cool. And it does seem like we're going to be using this most of the time, which is cool to see. Okay, so moving on to other stuff, let's talk about what has actually been changed or reworked. So again, I already mentioned Shadow Crash, but they added a second charge to the spell and now has a 15-second cooldown. So you're kind of able to fire this a lot more than you were used to, which is good. But we only get up to 6 targets baseline, so in larger packs, if you're doing big packs after big pack, that can be a little difficult. But overall, I think this is a nice quality of life change, especially if you're doing like 1 pack at a time type stuff in Mythic Plus. And this is a massive, massive buff in kind of raid environments. This kind of covers any kind of ad situation in raid. This thing is going to be great. And it's also a nice little like mobility thing that we can use as well to refresh dots and even get a little bit of damage out with aforementioned damage buff talent as well. A couple other things to note. They made shadowy apparitions can crit now baseline. Not really too much to cover. They kind of already did this. It's just more of a math thing, so they can scale it a little separately. They did also change Death Speaker. So Death Speaker is no longer a proc. It's now completely passive. Unfortunately, as of recording this video, this talent is bugged. It's supposed to just basically increase our execute window up to 35%. That bit is just not working right now as of now on PTR. I'm hopeful that once the build actually goes live, they can actually look at this and fix the bug. But until then, we can't. There's no reason to use this talent. So hopefully it gets fixed soon because we were planning on using this with our Void Weaver builds. They also made Dark Evangelism just a straight up passive, no longer like a buff that we're trying to keep uptime on. And then they reworked a couple other things as well. The other thing that I'll kind of note as, you know, the big kind of changes are with some of our idle spells. So Idol of Yasharaj got kind of gutted. It's now just a haste proc spell. Just says your damaging spells have a chance to grant you this haste buff. And then when it ends, you get negative haste. So it's like that little bit of a weird kiss curse thing. So yeah, kind of sad. Doesn't really do much, but there it is. And then Idol of Exhaust. The thing was also changed quite substantially. Basically, it's kind of a priority target machine. Just does a lot of good damage on a sustained single target. And the cool thing with this is it also triggers Psychic Link. So it kind of is rewarding you to pick a target and stick with it. This is what this talent is good at. And it also gives you some passive insanity generation as well, which is nice. So yeah, those are the kind of changes to talents that we have. Let's move on to the kind of changes and kind of what we're going to see with talents. All right, guys, let us talk about talents. So obviously the biggest question on everyone's mind is, are we playing Archon or are we playing Void Weaver? The answer is actually going to be very similar if you played in Season 2. The answer is basically both. They each have their own strong suits, and depending on the situation you're in, you can pretty much make either one work in just about anything. Now, there's a lot of caveats to what I just said, and you know, as we kind of dive into builds, I do have examples for Void Weaver and Archon for all example scenarios. Both I'll go over them here and in the written guide. Realistically, though, we basically only have two builds. There's one Archon build and one Void Weaver build, and we like barely move like 1 point around depending on how much AoE that we're actually in. So to start off with, in preseason, you're pretty much just going to be playing Archon. And the reason for that is, with all of the balancing that they did with hero talents, they actually buffed the crap out of Archon baseline, and Void Weaver's power doesn't really kick in until you get the new tier set bonus. So because of that, you know, Archon's sitting like 10%, 15% ahead of Void Weaver for most people in preseason with old tier and this new kind of rework that we have going for us. So with that being said, in preseason, you're pretty much going to be playing Archon. So here is what this build basically looks like for Archon. Very kind of standardy. If you've ever played like Archon in the past, very, very similar stuff. We are always taking Idol of Cthulhu. We're going to take Idol of Yogg-Saron again. And then we have to path into Idol of N'Zoth. Now, we're pretty restricted when it comes to pathing and node options with the way things got balanced this tier. Madness Weaving, one of the new talents, is just really strong. So we basically always want to take this in all of our builds. And then it's just kind of a matter of like, how do we path to that and the other stuff that we want? And this is how that ends up working. So should end up playing pretty similar to what we had before. We're still taking Mind's Eye, Void Eruption, although we are, you know, obviously we're stuck with Flay with Archon still. And then we're going to work in Shadow Crash. Now, because we're also taking Mental Decay, Shadow Crash isn't that big of a deal here. You know, technically you can gain like a very minuscule amount of damage by dropping this on pure single target, but we're talking like 0.2%, if that. So I opt to just suggest taking it all the time. I think it's a nice movement global anyways, especially since we kind of lost those Death Speaker procs coming into this season. So otherwise, it should play pretty similar. In this current iteration, we're currently taking Mindbender in this, but we'll talk about that when we get into other builds. So now, as we start adding targets, again, pretty simple if you can watch the transition. So if we want to go to the 3-target build, which is relevant for in the next raid, there is a 3-target council boss. So when we do that, we're going to take 1 point out of Phantasmal Pathogen, because it's just a single target thing, and we're going to throw it into Dark Evangelism. Just scales a little bit better, okay? Very, very, very simple change. Now, if Death Speaker wasn't bugged, like I mentioned before, we would probably slot this in because Bender just doesn't scale as much. But because Death Speaker is bugged, we're going to keep playing Bender. And then if you want to go into Mythic Plus and you say, hey, wait a minute, I need to add Silence. Okay, great. We just dropped the last point of Phantasmal Pathogen and we put that into Silence. Okay, so that is the Archon build. This is what we're primarily going to be playing in preseason. Now, of course, if you don't really care about the 10% gain, you can go ahead and play Void Weaver if you want. I know a lot of folks are going to be like, hey, I'm used to playing like Liberation of Undermine raid bosses as Void Weaver. I'm just going to keep doing that. Go for it. No big deal. Now, the talents I'm going to show you are going to be the same with or without tier. I haven't really seen any changes that we would make with that. So there is that. And let's kind of show you the Void Weaver build. So Void Weaver is struggling more right now, not only because we don't have tier yet, kind of with preseason, and the Death Speaker bug is primarily affecting Void Weaver. Death Speaker, one of the coolest things that this talent was unlocking was Depth of Shadows. It actually bumped Depth of Shadows to 35% as well, so we had a stronger execute profile with this kind of setup. You take Depth of Shadows and Death Speaker. Because of that bug, we are just going to take Bender with Void Wraith instead, and we're just not going to touch Death of Shadows or Death Speaker. So hopefully that bug gets fixed and we kind of get a better execute profile out of this build. Otherwise, just kind of walk through it. So similarly, we're going to take Idol of N'Zoth and Cthulhu all the time. No real surprises there. A lot of the structure of the build is going to be the same, and kind of the big points that we care about are still the ones we care about here. We are going to switch to Destroyed Reality, just gives us more room to press Void Blast and other things in that rotation. And we are going to also take Shadow Crash. Now with this, we're taking one of the new talents. Instead of Mental Decay, we're going to take Shattered Psyche, which just further buffs our Mind Blast. This is like that replacement for Mind Melt. So it is kind of weird playing Void Weaver without Mind Spike now. But we do still get this to compensate to get those bigger Mind Blast casts off. Dark Evangelism scales pretty nicely, especially because it's just adding on top of Inner Quietus. All those numbers kind of play off each other, which is great. And again, like I said, unfortunately taking Bender. Now, we are also taking kind of one of the weird new talents, which is Idol of Yashiraj. This is that kind of haste proc that I was talking about before. Just mathematically, this thing just works out better. There's not a whole lot of other things that we can take looking at this that just makes sense. And that's just kind of how things work out right now, of like the point value of stuff. And, this is just tuned a little bit better. If for whatever reason you don't like playing with this, it's not that big of a deal. You can take Idol of Yogg-Saron instead. This is like that alternative option. Now, the reason why I don't suggest this and then I would stick with Yashiraj by default is the pet AI is just not something I like to rely on if you don't have to. Yogg-Saron, even in this build, is not that big of a portion of our damage. So that's why I opt to drop it and just take the marginally same DPS talent, Yashiraj, just because it's, when it procs, you can always take advantage of it as long as you're hitting the target. Whereas Yogg-Saron might be running around doing weird aimless stuff. And I just don't like to rely on the pet AI personally. But that's my take. Yashiraj also, because it's like a proc effect, you can't actually high roll this thing. So like on average, like they're very, very close. But if you look at like max DPS, Yashiraj actually does win out in that kind of max quartile, whatever that is. Okay, so this is pure single target. If you want to swap up to 3 targets, we're going to drop that point in Phantasmal Pathogen and swap it over to Dark Thoughts, which is just giving Shadowy Insight a bit more procs. Okay, so this is really nice. If you get super lucky with this, you're getting bigger Void Blast to cleave in these kind of 3 target situations. That's all that's doing. Now, as soon as we go into Mythic Plus, all we do is just drop that point, right? We say, hey, that's the lowest value point in the tree. We're going to put that into Mental Fortitude, Silence, whatever it actually is. Works out to be basically the same either way. So yeah, because of Mythic Plus, we're going to want both of these. So those are basically, we have those 2 builds, Archon and Void Weaver. In preseason, I would highly suggest defaulting to Archon. Once you get the new 4 set, Void Weaver basically becomes my preference for raiding content, especially if we assume that Death Speaker is going to get fixed. And then inside of Mythic Plus, it can be pretty similar to this season, where Void Weaver is going to be good for your kind of lower keys up to like that weekly key you're just doing to fill your vault out. But for anyone that wants to actually push Mythic Plus, Archon is still going to be the thing that we scale the most with Void Eruption and targets and that kind of thing. And you'll get more value out of that in general, especially as you're able to chain packs together. Okay, so that is our my brief overview on talents. Let's move on to the next stuff. All right, so let's kind of cover rotation changes a little bit. Before we move on, I just want to kind of highlight, if you did kind of forget which builds go where, nice little new feature on Icy Veins where I actually kind of highlighted like when to use each of the builds that we just talked about. So if you're ever not sure, this gives you that full guidance right on this page. So, all right, moving on to the rotation page, kind of selecting defaults for what we just talked about. Let's cover Void Weaver first here this time. For the most part, this is going to be very, very similar to what we have today. There's not really a whole lot of changes, except a little bit in the opener, because now we've lost, or eventually, you're going to lose that Season 2 set bonus where we get that extra Void Bolt, which is actually very helpful for Insanity Generation to make sure we have a Devouring Plague right after that Dark Ascension cast. So that's still the same. We are kind of more incentivized to pre-cast Shadow Crash if you can, just because it gives us a little bit more insanity than a Vampiric Touch does, and that little bit of insanity is actually quite helpful. So we're going to Halo before the pull still, pre-cast Shadow Crash if you can, and then you're going to Void Wraith, and then the safest thing to do is to just do a single Mind Blast. This will get reset, so it's not that big of a deal. And then if you ended up having to Vampiric Touch, you might have to Mind Flay. But eventually, your goal is to get to 25 Insanity and then hit Dark Ascension. Now, again, in preseason, you don't have to worry about this too much. You can pretty much always skip this because you're going to get 10 Insanity for free if you have the Season 2 tier set. And again, things are just going to kind of go out from normal from there, right? You're going to press Dark Ascension, Power Infusion, Combat Potion, whatever else you have, Devouring Plague, Void Torrent, Void Blast twice. So that's your opener, okay? Should be pretty straightforward. Now, if we move into the priority list, just to kind of talk about where stuff goes where, we've tried to really simplify this to hopefully make it a little bit easier. I know I say that and it's still 17 steps. I promise it's not that crazy. Really, the only thing to kind of keep in mind here is where Void Volley is. It's really the only change with this because everything else we already have in this kit. So with Void Volley, just be a little careful. You're going to get that kind of, hey, I have this thing, I want to press it right now. But just know you have 20 seconds to actually press that button, so you don't have to be that stressed out about actually getting that casted. So if we're kind of just doing like a very quick example here. All right, we'll get the Halo out before we start, and then you can immediately lob that Shadow Crash when combat starts. And then you're going to hit Void Wraith here in this case, do our 1 Mind Blast. Then we're going to Dark Ascension, and this is where you just kind of go into that normal burst that we talk about, use that Trinket. And then we're just going to go to this quite terrible proc luck with that Void Blast there. But then you're just really trying to not cap on Insanity. Dots are falling off. We'll go ahead and recast that. And okay, I'm at a breakpoint now, and then I use Void Volley, right? So don't stress yourself out too much to cast it as soon as possible. And I wasn't really I was kind of talking through that, but that's the idea, right? Don't feel like you have to slam Void Volley as soon as it becomes available. Okay. With Archon, let's kind of switch gears a little bit. So come up here, we'll hit the Archon toggle instead. Make sure talents got swapped over correctly. Okay, so with Archon, things are a little different because of just the way tuning worked out. So unfortunately, especially with the new tier set, with all the buffs and everything to base Mind Flay and Mind Flay Insanity, all this other stuff, we're a little disincentivized to cast Void Torrent too much inside of Void Eruption itself. So what we actually end up doing here, we pre-cast Shadow Crash, get our dots applied, and then we just go right into Void Torrent. And then, this is, we get the Cthulhu proc, we get some of that Insanity Generation, and then we just Halo Mindbender right into Void Eruption. So we're literally just skipping those 2 extra Mind Blasts. We don't care about it. If you're playing Archon, your Mind Blast damage is pretty whatever. You're pretty much just worried about Mind Flay Insanity damage, and then you just go right along and do the rest of the rotation as normal. Same kind of thing. Nothing else has really changed here. So that opener, if anything, got a little simpler just because of that one little weird tweak that we have just with tuning and that kind of stuff. So with this, we don't want to pre-cast Halo, right, because we actually want that as part of our Archon rotation. So all we're simply going to do is you're going to come over here. You're going to hit Shadow Crash. When that lands, you Void Torrent that guy up. You can either Mindbender first or Halo first. It doesn't really matter. And then you just go right into Void Eruption. I don't have PI available, but you get the idea. And then at this point, you're really just your Mind Flay Insanity machine. Make sure at some point you weave in that Void Volley that we have there. They're going to be a little tighter on this one just because of, since we're pre-casting Void Torrent there. And that's it. You're just going to kind of live in this rotation. And it's okay, honestly. You might cap Insanity a little bit. but that's just how this build functions. There's just a lot going on. And again, you can see here, I've gotten my Void Torrent back, and at this point, kind of weave it in where you can, but if you need to cancel it to move, it's really not that big of a deal with this build. We're pretty much only using it to get the extra Insanity procs from our Cthulhu Tendrils that don't seem to be working right now, which is funny. And yeah, and that's kind of it for this build. Okay, for preseason, not a whole lot's going to change for stats and for gearing, but I will let's do a little bit of an overview of what's going to happen so you can kind of prepare for that as you go into things. So if you haven't actually seen it, I do give pretty detailed breakdowns for Voidweaver and Archon for kind of stats for single target and for AoE. A lot of this should feel pretty similar, although there's going to be a little bit of a change here, particularly when it comes to Voidweaver. So with Voidweaver, in particular, once we get the new set, we don't need as much haste. The set itself is giving us more casts of Void Blast, otherwise it's playing pretty much the same. And because of that, we don't get as much value from it, so we're actually only going to want between 18 and 22% haste when you're actually playing Voidweaver. And so basically the stat priority for Voidweaver is kind of interesting. We hit that first DR threshold of Mastery, which is like at 22%. And then we go to haste at about 20%. And then the rest we just send to crit and verse. Actually getting a little bit of verse in this build is normal, just because, we're running out of other stuff to put it in. So we're still kind of mastery haste build, but crit's really close. And then verse obviously is right behind it as well. In AoE, it kind of goes back to what we would consider normal. So you still have this kind of mastery haste build where we're hitting the first DR threshold of both haste and mastery now. And then we hit crit and verse after that. Now with Archon, a lot of it's going to feel pretty similar. It's quite like what we've been building already. Again, you hit the first DR threshold of mastery, a little bit less haste, at least in single target, and then you go crit. Versatility does not work out as much for Archon. It likes just dumping more into crit in this case. And then for AoE, very similar as well. You kind of start shifting a little bit more into haste over mastery when it comes to Archon and AoE, and then crit into verse. So when you're gearing Shadow Priest in preseason, as we get into the season, my advice for you is just to keep pieces around to move around stuff, and you pretty much want to gear 2 sets. Set 1 is your, hey, I'm going to use this like as my Archon set and my Voidweaver AoE set. And then set 2 is like a Voidweaver single target build that can drop a little bit more haste. Those would be the 2 builds I would really aim for. And if you are the person that's going to be pushing high-end Mythic Plus keys, you could add a 3rd build in there, which is just turbo going into haste instead of a little bit less crit there as well. So 2 or 3 gear sets, and that's kind of the way to cover all of your different scenarios as a Shadow Priest. All right, moving along here. Nothing is really going to change with gems and that kind of stuff. All that stuff is the same. One thing I want to note about Enchants that will change this patch, when this change is going to be kind of relative to your gear, but as of recording this video, they still have not buffed the Authority of the Depths enchants and that kind of Radiant enchants that we're using in the past for our weapons. They did do this going from Season 1 to Season 2. I was kind of expecting them to do it going into Season 3, but so far they haven't. And because those guys are not actually scaling off our item level, they are severely undertuned once you get starting to get some new gear into this patch. So you will likely start seeing this, probably maybe not in preseason, but like when you're hitting like normal raid, item level, and that kind of stuff. We're going to start swapping to the secondary stat proc weapon enchants. In particular, the 2 that I see the most value out of is Stonebound Artistry, which is the Mastery proc, or Oathsworn, which is the Verse proc. These are just the kind of generic ones that pop up all the time. There is a little bit as well with like, you could run Stormrider's Fury if you're doing like big AoE Archon stuff. Like that is kind of a viable choice. Otherwise, I think for a lot of people, I would just default to Stonebound Artistry myself. Otherwise, everything else is going to stay the same. There's nothing else new that's coming from an Enchants perspective. Okay, so let's cover gearing. All right, so if we go into gearing real quick, again, I'm really focusing on preseason here, so you might be doing some Mythic Zeros and that kind of thing. I will kind of showcase a little bit of like what to farm and what you're kind of looking for as you're going through these dungeons. I will kind of highlight this list of like kind of curated of like, here are the best slots in all the different dungeons for everything that we care about as a Shadow Priest that only drop in dungeons. So if you haven't seen this, go to the Mythic Plus gear section, and this kind of gives you all of those drops. For us this season, there's a lot of good dungeons to kind of think about here. I think basically all the ones coming from the War Within are basically going to be our Trinket dungeons. So Priory, Dawnbreaker, Trinkets are both nice. Our Car is also nice for Sackbrood. And then we also have the kind of new dungeon, Ecodome Aldani, is going to be really nice for trinkets as well. And there it also drops a one of our the top rings that we care about too. Now, as far as other than that, Halls of Atonement also going to be a really nice dungeon for us. We get a neck in there, another ring, also shoulders, which is going to be the preferred slot that we drop going into the next season. So getting a good pair of Mastery Haste shoulders for our new tier is going to be really nice. And you can also if you're currently legs off piece, you can take these legs from Eric Era. Halls also gives our kind of haste crit boots, which are kind of the best you can get in terms of keys, or at least mythic dungeons. So there is that. So yeah, check out this list. Hopefully it kind of helps you in that kind of early gearing process. And then of course you have the kind of overall best in slot list as well. So yeah, we will be running the Rushy Ramps once we get access to these, and these are just kind of a lock all the time. And we're going to put our Mastery Thread in here as kind of our go-to as a Shadow Priest. Okay, a couple other things to cover. We also have a lovely trinket tier list here. So if you're kind of looking and curious where things kind of fall in, I've done my best to kind of rank how they kind of come about, kind of go over some other trinkets as well. Delve trinkets, obviously we're going to have a lot of access to these with kind of preseason stuff. So take a look at these and the kind of, again, early gearing stuff. Nothing in here is going to be BIS. And that's kind of what things look like right now. Other thing that I'll cover, kind of a common question, we do currently have the kind of special belt item that we're wearing. We're pretty much going to wear this until you get some kind of 710, 714 item level equivalent, and that's when it starts to kind of fall off. So once you get kind of a belt in kind of that range, you can likely see it break even or start to drop. So especially once you hit kind of mythic rating item levels, you'll end up dropping this overall. Okay, so other things to cover with weapons this tier, we are going to look to use the special dagger weapon. Just gives another little extra proc, kind of like we did with the Muggsy weapon that we had this tier. We have another one of those this tier as well. We're likely not going to be preferring to run the 2-set, but that is an option if you care about a little bit of defensive option as well. Now, with that, our crafted items. So that's the thing I'll kind of cover next, is kind of the crafted situation. Just kind of give you a prep work into walking into this season. Generally speaking, things are going to be the same as what they were in Seasons 1, Seasons 2, more or less, right? We care about Ascension and Writhing Armor Binding. This is going to be our go-to combination for raiding. It's really just a question of when you actually get items to make that happen. So if you get super lucky and you get this special dagger early, well then go ahead and upgrade your offhand, right? If you're not going to get that, and if you don't get that early on in the season, you might just want to bank up your 2 sparks and just craft a big 2-handed weapon just to start out with. And this would be a big upgrade early on just to get you through progression. Just kind of depends on what your priorities are and kind of your kind of progression schedule. And eventually we're going to put Writhing Armor Banding. Now, we'll eventually put on Wrists is kind of be our preferred slot. Because the Reshi Wraps kind of lock our cloak slot, we don't have a whole lot of choices to put stuff because there are also special boots that drop in the raid as well that double or increase the value out of the Reshi Wrap. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Because of that, we can really only do wrist, jewelry. You could do waist as well if you really want to, but again, it's going to be a weird craft because we still have the belt from this season. So yeah, likely crafting is going to stay the same for that. Now, if you do care about just Mythic Plus, you could kind of skip this advice because Ascension doesn't get as much value there. And you could just go with double Dust Thread or double Dawn Thread. That is another option you have as well. But for the most part, things are going to stay the same. All right, guys, that is all we have for this video. I know it was a lot, but this is just kind of the preseason hype video. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see once the season actually launches for real. I'll try to do as much as I can as people get interested in stuff or as there is stuff to talk about. But again, thank you so much for watching. Thanks to everyone that supports me on here, Twitch, YouTube members, all that stuff. I really appreciate it. All the support, guys. Patreon members as well, if you're not still around. So big shout out to all of you guys, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.